Hi, everyone. My name is Rory Finnin. I am Associate Professor of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Cambridge. I'm the author of the new book, Blood of Others, Stalin's Crimean Atrocity and the Poetics of Solidarity, which is being published by University of Toronto Press in a matter of weeks. Put simply, I think, if I were to describe this for your audience, William, this is a book for anyone fascinated by the question of literature and its impact on the real world, on real lives, on real moments and movements in history, particularly in Ukrainian history, which is at the center of the book. And my project explores the ways in which literary texts, let's say, expand our moral horizons, make us more sensitive to the concerns, the situations and conditions of other people who don't think like us, don't look like us, don't pray like us. And I think it has a lot of resonance now, not only because of what we're seeing with this escalation of troop buildup on Ukraine's borders, but also because we're still enduring this pandemic, and solidarity with various communities seems in short supply these days. We have a lot of division in societies. So this book actually restores certain moments where you can see an overflowing of different forms of solidarity. And it reminds us how art is really key to making it possible. So that was important to me, particularly as someone who comes at the study of Ukraine from the perspective of the humanities, because I was reached, my interest in Ukraine came initially through literature. And so in the humanities, we often talk about and theorize even about this world-changing power of art in very abstract, highly theoretical ways. This book, Blood of Others, really gets real and kind of gets grounded, tells the remarkable story of poetry and prose that made a really demonstrable, documented difference to the lives of the Sunni Muslim people nearly destroyed by Stalin in 1944. I'm speaking, of course, of the Crimean Tatars of Ukraine. The book really was born probably about 25 years ago when I was given a volume of poetry by Mykола Rudenko. I was a United States Peace Corps volunteer in a village in central Ukraine at the time. I remember reading this volume many times because I was at a stage in my study of Ukrainian where I could sometimes make it through various poems. I went through a few after a number of weeks, but there was always one in particular I struggled with, and it was a song called Tatariin, the Crimean Tatar. I had to read this poem over and over again. I couldn't understand it because it's highly paradoxical and contradictory. So it's a reflection of, on the part of the lyrical persona, on the part of Rudenko's lyrical I, on a terrible childhood memory, which was the sight of seeing a Crimean Tatar beaten to death by his fellow villagers in Donbas. So Rudenko's lyrical persona professes a love for his compatriots in Donbas and a hatred of them at the same time for what they do to this innocent man. So he struggles with what it means to be a part of a community that committed a crime. He struggles with what it means to be affected, tarnished, labeled almost by the sins of others. So the poem was an attempt to process a kind of guilt, a guilt that he didn't have any personal connection to, but was something that attached itself to his identity as obviously from Donbas, but also from Ukraine. So this emotion of guilt actually is critical to what I call the poetics of solidarity. How these literary texts work is they invite us to process guilt. So Rudenko's work disturbed me, as I mentioned. I had to read it so many times before I could really understand this push and pull in the poem. And then it, really impressed me as profoundly authentic and brave. And I never forgot it. And so years later, when I embarked on a PhD in Ukrainian studies at Columbia University in New York, I kept finding various poems in libraries and archives in Kyiv and Ankara that took a similar interest in the Crimean Tatar other, especially after their brutal deportation at the hands of Stalin in 1944. It was like these texts were finding me in a way. So I continued to compile them, to collate them. And along the way, I just was always interested in what were they trying to do? And why write a poem, after all, if you encounter suffering of other human beings, the recourse to first circulate a poem or a short story about that suffering, about that event, is not straightforward. It's somewhat quizzical. As you know, like the Holodomor, the Crimean Tatar deportation was an extremely radioactive subject in the Soviet Union. It was not widely known. If one did hear about it, one rarely spoke of it or spoke of it in whispers. So that silence was broken. And what broke that silence were not open letters, manifestos, the kinds of things we often associate with what we call documentary samvidav or samizdat. Rather, it came earlier, and that silence was broken by literary works. So I tried to compile these different works in the Ukrainian language in particular, the Russian language, the Turkish language, to see how they were working in common toward a similar goal. That was a project of many years. And then I realized in pursuing the project that I was leaving out the Crimean Tatars themselves. So I was focusing on people referring to them, representing them, but I wasn't able to read Crimean Tatar language literature myself so that I could get a fuller picture. So I spent a number of years, particularly since the annexation in 2014, when the conditions and the plight of the Crimean Tatars became even more pressing, I realized we needed to actually study their voices more directly. So I've been working on that as well. They're also a big part of the book in that respect. A lot of these materials came from libraries themselves. So they were often ensconced in collections of samizdat, samvidav. Sometimes they had been published separately. Some of them were in various archives like the Petro Grigorenko archive in Amherst. I found a number in Ankara, in the National Library in Turkey. They were actually novels and pulp fiction novels that had been sanctioned by the Turkish military and sold at highly discounted prices to Turkish soldiers. But these were Turkish pulp fiction novels about Crimean Tatars who had suffered at the hands of Soviet power. So this use of a Crimean Tatar figure, this focus on Crimea in particular in Turkey, was extensive and surprised me greatly. As for the differences, they're really fascinating. In the case of Soviet Russian dissidents, let's call them dissidents, it was a very contested term, as you know, dissident. Inakodumsi in Ukrainian was a much more acceptable term for people like Grigorenko and others. They often refer to this deportation of the Crimean Tatars as a symptom of a broader Soviet disease. Ukrainians and Ukrainian language representations take an additional move. They see it as a symptom of a Soviet disease, but they also, let's say, metaphorically relate to the Crimean Tatars as well. So there's a lot going on in this literature in terms of unpacking the experience of Ukrainians and seeing them through the prism of the Crimean Tatars and vice versa. And when we look at Ukrainian literature in depth and we look specifically to the fin de siècle, turn of the century period, we see, particularly in works by Lesya Ukrainka, Mykhailo Kotsiubynsky, a concerted effort to start this metaphorical mirroring with Crimean Tatars quite early, late 19th century, early 20th. And that becomes a trend over the course of the 20th century, which is really remarkable when you consider how many stories of Crimean Tatars raiding Ukrainian villages for centuries had been the norm in a great deal of Ukrainian literature. And in fact, in Crimean Tatar literature, you'll see sometimes references to Ukrainians as participating in their dispossession. So there is a tendency there that a lot of these canonical works by people like Ukrainka, Kotsiubynsky, and many others on the Crimean Tatar side to overcome that story of mutual antagonism. So that's amazing to me how this literature pushed back against that gravity. So in the case of Russian Soviet dissidents, there's this notion that the Crimean Tatar experience and their dispossession, the deportation, that it was a symptom of a broader Soviet disease. Soviet Ukrainian writers are looking at it as, yes, indeed a symptom, but one that speaks to our experience too. And then in the Turkish case, there's more of a conflation that is, the Crimean Tatars become less Crimean Tatars than Crimean Turks. So their specific national territorial identity is changed, and they become a variant of a Turkic people that can stand in for other Turks as well. And in fact, in the context of the Second World War, as you know, Turkey was a neutral party, didn't take part in the fighting. Interestingly, in a great deal of post-war Turkish literature, the Crimean Tatar becomes that figure that allows them access to these memories of wartime suffering. So the Crimean Tatar figure becomes very, very central to Turkish literature after the war, such that actually even now in Turkish secondary school curricula, there are many novels by Cengiz Dağcı about Crimean Tatars, about the dispossession of Crimea, about the Soviet deportation. And we in Ukrainian studies and Slavic studies just never really look over to what's happening in Turkey and to the literature in Turkey to see these commonalities. And that was really important for me to do. There have been numerous collections, including some emblematic collections edited by Edward Allworth, that have numerous articles and studies about aspects of Crimean Tatar culture and society, but there hasn't been, let's say, a consistent in-depth focus on their culture in conversation with others. So one of the things that I point to is this tremendous correspondence, it's almost eerie, between figures like Ukrainka and Kotsiubynsky and their counterparts in Crimean Tatar literature, who are often saying very similar things. They're relating to their own colonial experience. It's a really important thing to keep in mind. When we read Ukrainians thinking through the experience of Crimean Tatars, that thinking through allows them to see themselves as colonized people. And so Ukrainka actually has a remarkable story called Nad Morem, at the seaside, that has a pivotal moment involving a young Crimean Tatar boy. And if your viewers have read this story, you'll remember there's an anonymous narrator who's a woman very much like Ukrainka, who spent a lot of time in Crimea, where she could rest and look after herself given her various ailments and illnesses. And she makes friends with this Russian Muscovite debutante. She really can't stand this Russian Muscovite debutante, but nonetheless, they have this social interaction. And a Crimean Tatar boy bumps into them on the street. The Muscovite debutante reacts, calls him a name, and the Ukrainian narrator, Ukrainka's counterpart, speaks of seeing the gaze this boy gives the debutante and immediately relating to it and understanding what she calls the temny pohlad, this dark gaze. And so it becomes a way for, I call this anti-colonial sightseeing, seeing through the sight of another, through the gaze of another, that you yourself are a colonized subject. So this conversation that's going on between Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars is hugely important to, let's say, the development of Ukrainian national identity, which I think over recent decades has become very comfortable talking about the Russian imperial and the Soviet experience as an experience of colonization. I will speak specifically here about the Ukrainian experience and in a couple of my Ukrainian-centric chapters, because the book is trying something new. It's trying to position the study of Ukrainian culture, not necessarily with reference to Russian culture, Polish culture, but looking at it in conversation with all the cultures and traditions of the Black Sea. Mykhailo Kotsiubynsky talked about the need for Ukrainians and cultural actors and activists to have a so-called Black Sea orientation. And so among the Ukrainian poets who are writing particularly about the deportation, I can name one of them in particular, maybe known to your audience, named Iván Sokulski. Sokulski is well remembered today as one of the authors of the so-called List Tvorчої молоді, the letter of the young creative youth of Dnipropetrovsk, today's Dnipro. This is a remarkable letter, again, speaking of this consciousness of colonialism and its impact on Ukrainian culture. This is a letter that speaks, it may not use the term often, but it's speaking with that, that message that The Ukrainian cultural experience has often been one of a colonized culture. And it is inspired in large measure by Oles Honchar's Sobor, the cathedral, often by Ivan Zuba's internationalism or Russification. So Sokulsky was very central to that project. As you may remember, once the list Tvorчої молоді was broadcast on Radio Liberty, so many of its authors were arrested. Sokulsky was one of them. So Sokulsky was also a very sensitive poet. And he writes a remarkable poem called Bakhchisarai, Sickle, so a kind of cycle. This is poetry hugely influenced by, of course, you won't be surprised, Taras Shevchenko. So there are lots of intertexts to Shevchenko's works, lots of recitations, reinterpretations of various couplets of Shevchenko's verse. So they're channeling Shevchenko in new ways. So in this sense, their style is very similar to his. They often speak with this full-throated anger and sarcasm often for the posture and the actions of the colonizer, or in this case, Stalin. But obviously we know from the 19th century how Shevchenko let the Tsar have it in his poetry, we might say. So stylistically, there's a lot of this reinterpretation of Shevchenko's sympathy, his empathy for others, his solidarity with subaltern oppressed peoples. This begins with, of course, the poem Kavkaz, a poem really not about Ukrainians, but anyone who spent time on Maidan in 2013, 2014 could see the couplet Боритеся, бо борете, вам Бог помагає. Fight, you will prevail, God is helping you. It was brandished on numerous posters, spray painted on shields. That was a message initially Shevchenko intended for the Circassian Muslim peoples fighting Russian conquest in the middle of the 19th century, but it becomes channeled and understood by Ukrainians today as a message to them too. So Shevchenko, in writing about the experiences of Muslim peoples, was saying something about Ukrainian identity too. So this practice is something I call national metaphorization. It's kind of a fancy term, but basically it's just kind of cutting to this remarkable dynamic in which you can write about your own identity and speak to your own experience, but you do it through the experience of another nation altogether. So we see Sokulsky do this with Bakhchisarai, this poem about the Crimean Tatar deportation, written in this Shevchenkian style. It ends with this declaration of cognitive dissonance. Ya bachu Bakhchisarai, ya ne bachu Bakhchisaraya. I see Bakhchisarai, but I don't see Bakhchisarai. That is, I see a place that used to be the seat of Crimean Tatar culture, but all the people have been evacuated, so many of them killed. The experience of his lyrical persona viewing this place is tortured and leads him to process lots of ideas and narratives about his own experience as a Ukrainian. So this was a poem that circulated in Sam Vidav. It was a poem, in fact, that Vyacheslav Chornovil and Mustafa Dzhemilev corresponded about. So one thing that we need to understand about the Soviet period, particularly among so-called dissident circles, was how they, across different languages and contexts, tried to stay in touch with each other. And for quite some time, Chornovil wanted to meet Dzhemilev, who of course was incarcerated, but they shared letters with each other. Chornovil was interested in Dzhemilev's journey through the Gulag system. And among the things they talk about are poems written by Ukrainians that speak to the Crimean Tatar experience to show that our people are thinking of you too. And they're doing it in this really nuanced, productive way, processing guilt in a variety of ways. Another work that is at the center of these discussions, another work referenced by Chornovil to Dzhemilev, is Roman Ivanichuk's Malvi, which is a historical novel initially published in the Soviet period to great acclaim, but it took the Soviet censor and Soviet authorities some time to notice that in fact it was an analogy. that this presentation of the events of the 17th century involving the Ottoman Empire, the Crimean Tatar Khanate, and the Ukrainian Cossacks led by Bogdan Khmelnytsky was actually an analogy for, on the one hand, the Soviet Empire, Ukraine, Soviet Ukraine, and the experience of the contemporary Crimean Tatar community. So Ivan Ichuk intended this as a commentary about the historical narratives of Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars. So many readers understood that. And sure enough, after some time, the Soviet censor did too. They pulled the novel off the shelves, a very familiar story for all of us, well-versed in Ukrainian literature over the centuries. So that was another work that spoke about a solidarity with the Crimean Tatars and an identification between Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars that saw thousands of readers. There were reading groups devoted to the novel. And it was also a novel that dissidents wrote about with each other, and they shared these texts with each other. Chornovil mentioned, and Jamilev asked him, please send me Sokolsky's Bakhchisarai, the poem I mentioned before. So Chornovil obliges, and then he also says, and there's another work by Ivan Ichuk that you should read, and I'll try to send you passages of that as well. So literature was this tool, this mechanism of a deeper reflection and a relationship that led these different groups to draw inspiration from each other. And for me, as someone invested in the study of literature, always amazed by how art can change things in the real world, but how we don't have a language to describe it. These kinds of cases, I really felt needed to see the light of day and to be discussed more directly. William, you just reminded me as well, one of the things that strikes me, and I know this is kind of off our topic a little bit, not in direct answer to your question, but you raised earlier the text Svit Yablony, and I've always been struck by that authentic, honest portrayal of the difficult tension that any artist faces in the face of tragedy. I'm often reminded actually of a painting that Claude Monet did of his wife Camille as she was dying of cancer, and you could tell it was the same compulsion that he was mourning her, but needed to still paint her on her deathbed. So your question, though, about how Crimean Tatars processed this suffering and this pain, and it's important to step back and realize what happened in the deportation. First of all of us know about the 1944 deportation, but the depth of the violence and the brutality has not been as clear. So roughly, tens of thousands ultimately perished in the deportation. It was an event of savagery. So those who were placed on these cattle cars, sent to destinations eastward between 18th to 21st of May 1944 saw, for instance, families separated from each other. So you can imagine in the mayhem and urgency of placing Crimean Tatars in these cattle cars, they were overcrowded. The doors could not open. There were no toilets. There was no access to water. So you're talking about weeks and weeks in which many died along these journeys to the east. Sometimes families were placed in close proximate cattle cars, but as the journey took them to different destinations, these cars were often decoupled. So the separation of families was extremely torturous, even if you could survive the deportation. So to your point, how was this trauma processed? And it's worth saying here that so much of the Crimean Tatar literature does not address, at least in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, really in the 70s too, you don't see it. There's a silence about the details of the deportation. There's a silence in which nobody speaks what everyone knows. So there's a discussion about the legacy and the impact of what's happened, about the anger and the outrage, but there tends to be this gap in knowledge, and this is very common to Stalinist trauma and its cultural expression. you can't always see it, you know, in the texts about the Holodomor. There may not be the focus on the shock brigades that went from door to door taking grain. There's often the reflection on what's happened and the loss. That's similar here to Crimean Tatars. One man named Idris Isanin, who's just a young teenager actually, wrote a poem that is really the first cultural text about the tragedy. And for it, he got 25 years in prison, by the way. But it's a poem that just expresses this pain and the shock without talking about these various details. So there's something of a silence about the logistics, the details of the deportation operation that was so brutal, and instead a reflection about the meaning of this brutality. And one thing to note is how Shevchenko is an important tool even for these writers. So you find numerous Crimean Tatar poets who are a bit more free to publish after 1967. They write a number of poems to Taras Shevchenko under that title, to Taras Shevchenko, which is kind of common. We know how Shevchenko was much beloved in the Soviet period across different national contexts, and how he was something of a safe subject, according to Soviet censors anyway. And these Crimean Tatar figures begin to cite his exile into Central Asia. And so in citing it and explaining it and talking about his arduous journey to these places among black sands, they're actually speaking as well about their own deportation. So Shevchenko becomes this way they can speak about what's happened to them without being seen to do so. So another example of the predominant cultural figure in the Ukrainian context being a salve, a source of comfort and connection at a time when this community was dispossessed, alienated, accused of mass treason. At that time of pain, someone like Shevchenko really was a source of comfort. I didn't expect to find this embrace of the Crimean Tatar deportation as a plot and as a narrative in Turkish culture that I expected. I'd come upon it before. I didn't know how common it was. I didn't know when I started on this project how, in fact, the Turkish military was encouraging the production of various novels about Crimean Tatars. That was really a major revelation for me anyway, having some sense that, of course, the Crimean Tatars, due to their ethnic proximity, linguistic proximity, due to the fact that the Crimean Tatar diaspora is very prominent in the Republic of Turkey, I knew that they would be focused on one way or the other. What I didn't understand was just the extent of it. The millions of copies of books sold about Crimean Tatars. Cengiz Dağcı is a fascinating case because he grew up in Crimea, is caught up in the Second World War on both sides, eventually makes his way to Great Britain, never steps foot in the Republic of Turkey, but he is a widely cited, widely read figure in secondary schools in Turkey, in universities in Turkey. Erdogan and Davutoglu and all these Turkish politicians have cited his work as influential in their understanding of the dynamics of the Black Sea. So that, to me, that Turkish component was a major surprise. Actually, in the 60s, and one of the cultural actors that Olga Bertelsen in her wonderful new book focuses on to a degree in her study of the intelligentsia of Kharkiv. One of them is Boris Chichibabin, who was a veteran of the Transcaucasian Front in the Second World War, comes back to finish a degree in philology in Kharkiv, and is arrested almost immediately for a poem that was warning of a new Soviet terror. And he goes off to the Gulag, he returns, and one of the first things he does to get back in touch with his family is they go to Crimea, a place that to him was a kind of paradise. But he's hugely disturbed by what he encounters, because when he encounters the circumstances of the late 1950s, early 1960s, he sees this dynamic Crimean Tatar culture that he encountered as a boy completely gone. So one of my personal heroes, Miroslav Maronovich, also has a comparable experience experience when he was near Feodosia in Crimea, how he walked and found himself suddenly on an old Crimean Tatar village that had been emptied. And Marinovich explains this as discovering a kind of mass cemetery, a cemetery of an entire culture that had been taken away. So Chichibabin writes about this in probably the first work written 1959, 1960 about the Crimean Tatar deportation. So again, well before these open letters, well before journals and almanacs that we associate with samizdat culture. So journals like Ukrainsky Vestnik, Ukrainian Herald, the Chronicle of Current Events. Before all these journals and almanacs come out and talk about these events, it's poetry that's doing the heavy lifting. And so Chichibabin, this great Kharkiv poet who's been so influential to the culture of contemporary poetry in Eastern Ukraine, who wrote in the Russian language but who loved Ukraine very much, his poetry, because he had been in the Gulag, was closely watched. And so the major work that is the first poem to really address this, called Krymsky Progulki, has a really innocuous title, Crimean Strolls. This poem circulates all over the place in samizdat and samvidav. Chichibabin doesn't put his name on it, and for good reason. Among other things, it makes very clear that Crimea is not Russia. It expresses an outrage that Crimea in Soviet literature was being projected as this Russian Riviera when this act of ethnic cleansing had taken place and was never discussed. So he rails against, with ferocity, he rails against this injustice. So these texts are circulating all the way to Central Asia. So I had the opportunity to talk to Mustafa Jamilev about these various texts. And he remembers coming upon this poem, Krymsky Progulki, Crimean Strolls. And his first thought was, I wonder how much time he's going to get for this poem. That is, I wonder how many years in the Gulag he's going to get for this poem. And he distributed this poem into samvidav, samizdat circulation. So you have, in Kharkiv, in Moscow, all the way in places like Tashkent, these communities speaking across languages, learning from each other across religions and ethnic boundaries, spreading the same kinds of texts. And what Chichibabin would do, even though he didn't put his name on this poem, he would recite it in public. And these recitations shocked the conscience of those who were there and present. So I cite in the book numerous instances when colleagues and friends were shocked by the events in the poem. So they didn't know anything about the deportation. Chichibabin's poem was the first they had heard about it. So on the one hand, the poem informs them of what's happened, but secondly, urges them to process guilt about it. And in processing guilt about it, they get active themselves. So this is different from shame, because shame is an emotional reaction we have that's certainly about reflecting on our own agency in historical events, personal events. But shame is something that psychologists see as not conducive to action, not conducive to repair. We tend to retreat when we feel shame. Guilt is empowering. So guilt, and this is something that a lot of Soviet figures from Grigorenko to Chichibabin talk about with great enthusiasm. Embrace guilt, they say. Guilt enables us to reach across boundaries, to act in each other's interests, which is really remarkable, very progressive idea. And they use this literature to do so. So in his recitations, he moved so many readers to understanding what had happened in 1944, how it related to a broader set of problems in the Soviet Union. And so in doing that, he put people like his own partner, Lilia Karas Chichibabina, into this place where she had not met many Crimean Tatars before, but she felt very invested in fighting for their right to return to Crimea. And so she gets involved in spreading this poem in underground circles. And so numerous cases like this of people taking risks, the risk of arrest for people they never met, and how poetry allowed that to happen these are the kinds of things that today I need personally need to remind myself of. Otherwise, I become entirely cynical about everything. So in many respects, this research was a form of therapy in some ways, to see how this art made a difference. These poems reached these Crimean Tatar communities. I told you about how Dzhemilev immediately thought, well, how many years in the Gulag is this poet going to get? Starts to distribute it in his different circles. And then on top of it, the so-called initiative groups of the national movement of the Crimean Tatar people, these were the, let's say, action groups who petitioned Soviet power after 1967 in particular, for that right to return to Crimea. When they met, they would read poems at the start of every meeting. They would read their own Crimean Tatar language poems, a very prominent one by Noman Çelebi Cihan that I write about in the book. But they also read poems by Chichibabin, or they read other poems by Sokulski, and they write about how this was a major source of comfort, that others saw their suffering, and it allowed them to persevere. And they write about that. So we have demonstrable evidence of how this art helped their movement. It wasn't ornamentation. It wasn't a ritualized reading. It was something that helped them keep going and keep persevering in their fight, which of course in the late 1980s becomes a triumphant one. I mean, it's not for nothing. We look back on it now and think, well, it was bound to happen, but the Crimean Tatars had been deported in 1944. 50 years later, roughly, they're allowed to return to the Crimean Peninsula. And not only that, the Soviet regime declares Stalin's deportation as barbaric. So this cultural artistic project led to an amazing dividend, that in the late Soviet period, these Crimean Tatars were allowed to return to their ancestral homeland. And in the context of human history, when you see deportations like this take place, you don't often see 50 years later or so a return of those people to their native territory. But that happened here, and this art and this literature was a part of that process. The book spends a great deal of time talking about the post-Soviet experience, and particularly what happens in post-Soviet Crimea, the inability to recognize the challenge of decolonization, the way in which we weren't able to see, of course, that this project of decolonizing the peninsula involved things like reparations, electoral quotas. We didn't talk about it through that frame of colonization. We tended to talk about it as a balance of political interests between Russians, Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars. But one of the things that comes out of this failure is Crimean Tatar-Ukrainian solidarity that we now see in a very mature form after 2014. So the book goes into some detail to talk about what's happening in this conversation and exchange between Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars after 1991, how many Crimean Tatars were writing, including the great prose stylist in Crimean Tatar culture, Shamil Alyadin, who wrote a great deal about the alliance between the Crimean Tatars and Khmelnytsky's Cossacks in the 17th century, and gets into great detail about Khmelnytsky speaking Crimean Tatar with the Khan speaking Ukrainian in return. So this post-91 literature was investigating these relationships, maturing them, making them more sophisticated. And then obviously the book also focuses on the Russian annexation of 2014, and how since then this relationship has become a major source, a major narrative, a major plot in a great deal of contemporary Ukrainian culture, in the poetry of Serhiy Zhadan, which is a focus in the book, in a film called Evge, or Dodomo, by a wonderful filmmaker named Nariman Aliyev. These are really important cultural exchanges that are leading to political innovations. So one of the things we've seen evolve is something called the Crimean Platform, which is an opportunity for the Ukrainian state and Ukrainian society to not forget what 2014 represents, how Ukraine needs to keep Crimea on its mind, as it were, how culture is doing that, and how things like granting national territorial autonomy to the Crimean Tatars would be a strategic response to this Krim Nash Russian chauvinism that claims Crimea for Russian power. But in claiming it so often, William, it's also reflective of a kind of insecurity, which is very common to empires. They take territory but don't feel comfortable in it, so they need to constantly attest to that seizure. So granting autonomy and sovereignty through the Crimean Tatars in Crimea would be a strategic advantage for Ukraine today. It would be a source of, I think, a kind of just move on the part of the Ukrainian state with respect to the Crimean Tatars. The majority of the Ukrainian populace supports that idea, but various presidential administrations kind of kick the can down the road. So the book also deals with these more contemporary problems that have emerged after 2014. So that's one thing that I also want to raise that the book is trying to do. And what we find in the midst of this struggle, both in 1944 with the deportation and also post 2014, that often those who are encountering incredible challenge turn to art as a really efficient way of rallying people to their cause, a cause of mutual understanding. That fascinates me because, frankly, one might say from a pragmatic point of view, you publish an op-ed, you agitate politically. I mean, obviously those things need to happen as well. But those who take that time, whether it's through film, prose, poetry, to write a text that may reach people's emotions, that is a highly effective and highly efficient way of changing one's circumstances that we need to understand better. That's what the book's trying to do. I want to applaud you, if I haven't done this already, for all the work you do on this channel. And I'm always impressed with the quality of the conversations you have with our colleagues and the questions you ask. And I have done some podcasting and video editing in the past. I know how much time it takes. So thank you for all the time you've invested in it. You've gotten how many views over the years? I mean, you've moved the center of gravity significantly, I think. And like I said, not to embarrass you, but you should be really applauded.